Hi, everyone. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about housing as one of the contexts in which racial and ethnic discrimination continues to occur. Um, I said in the last video that these are going to be mostly a look at some contemporary conditions, but with housing, maybe even more so than with the other contexts, this is going to require a little bit of a historical dive because this is a really solid example of what we would call institutional race-based discrimination, in which the present conditions are deeply informed by and, in fact, shaped by the previous forms of housing discrimination that occurred in the past. So the United States, very racially segregated society, but the factors that make it as segregated as it is are not, in fact, the current operation of discriminatory laws and practices for the most part, but rather the legacy of decades and decades of prior legal institutional discrimination. So some of the things that have changed from the period of time we're going to start talking about up until the present have to do with some changes in law. So, for example, in 1948, in a Supreme Court case called Shelley versus Kramer, the Supreme Court overruled what are called restrictive covenants. A restrictive covenant is just a restriction on the use of land, including things like apartments, buildings, and houses, and things like that, so that the value of the land and enjoyment of the adjoining land will be preserved. So you could take a restrictive covenant then, and you could say, we're not going to sell any property in this neighborhood. If you buy this house, attached to the deed is going to be a commitment on your part as the purchaser not to sell your home when you decide to sell it, not to sell your home to a family of color or a person of color. That would be an example of a kind of restrictive covenant that would then further the preservation of racially segregated neighborhoods by making it such that you could not legally sell your house to somebody other than another white person or another white family. And in 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court shot that down in the Shelley versus Kramer case. 20 years later, in 1968, we get the Fair Housing Act, which is actually a smaller clause within a much larger civil rights package. But the Fair Housing Act in 1968 had a number of provisions in it that had to do with housing that included, among other things, a prohibition on the refusal to sell or rent because of race. So in restrictive covenants, you could set conditions where somebody was prohibited from selling to a person of color. In the Fair Housing Act, they strike down the practice of somebody refusing to sell to somebody because of race or rent to somebody because of race. One of the other provisions of the Fair Housing Act made it illegal to advertise racial preferences in the sale or rental advertising, I should say, for sale or rental housing. You could not say, we're going to rent to blacks only, or we're going to rent to whites only, right? So you're prohibited from advertising racial preference in your property sales or your property rental. It also prohibited interfering with people exercising those housing rights or organizations that would pursue and aggressively help people enforce the provisions of these housing the articles of the Fair Housing Act. So it was illegal to interfere with people trying to enforce the law, either organizations, people, or other bodies. So between Shelley v. Kramer in 48 and the Fair Housing Act in 68, a number of the legal sort of institutional structures that were used to maintain racially segregated neighborhoods sort of started to crumble. Now, that does not mean, of course, that neighborhoods instantly became desegregated. Long after the end of sort of official legal forms of segregation, there were still communities that would work very aggressively to maintain rigidly enforced racial boundaries. One phenomenon we find in the United States, kind of coming out of this period, is the emergence of what were understood to be sundown towns. Now, a sundown town is a town or a city or a neighborhood that is kind of purposely all white. And they become called sundown towns because the idea was that by the time the sun goes down, any black or more broadly, any non-white people in that town had to be out of the city or neighborhood boundaries, right? You could not stay after sundown. So legal segregation, informal, even illegal, but still practiced forms of discrimination created in the United States, and to some extent, even to this day, help to maintain a high degree of what we call residential segregation. Now, residential segregation is kind of exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a tendency for people in any two groups or races to live in separate areas. So, a couple of things that you should keep in mind. Residential segregation levels are highest in cities where the most minorities live. Blacks and Latinos experience higher than average levels of racial segregation in areas with the largest black populations. Blacks and whites are often most isolated from one another. And the way we measure this, by the way, is something called the index of dissimilarity. So the index of dissimilarity is essentially a measure of how much turnover would there have to be before a neighborhood became racially balanced, right? So it's kind of a function of just how it measures effectively how deeply segregated a community or a neighborhood or a town or a city might be. All right, so how did we get to be such a racially segregated society? Well, first, and as I suggested, it was done through legal means, right? So the structures of the U.S. legal system at the city level, at the municipal and county level, at the state level, and even at the federal level, provided a lot of cover for and legitimation of systemic and ongoing efforts to keep racial and ethnic groups from living in the same places. Part of that grows out of certainly out of the Jim Crow era, but some of the places where the racial residential segregation is highest are actually places outside of the South. Now, if you'll remember, I know this was a long time ago, but if you remember, we talked at one point about the patterns of racial oppression. We talked about paternalistic systems of racial oppression, and that these were really, really common in the pre-Civil War American South. And one of the features, when we look at paternalistic systems of racial oppression, one of the features is the degree to which the groups, both the dominant group and the subordinated group, had a lot of contact with one another, right? So plantation owners lived on plantations with the slaves who worked on the plantations. They didn't live in the same building, but they lived in very close proximity to one another. The towns where the whites would go to shop and to sell their products and to engage in social events would regularly put them in contact with non-whites, with blacks specifically. So there's a lot of intergroup contact in the pre-Civil War South. And in the post-Civil War South, the degree of residential segregation, at least immediately, is not all that great because so many of the former slaves and their descendants are working as sharecroppers on the land that's owned by the former plantation owners, right? So they never lost their property. They kept their property. They just basically subdivided it up and leased it out to tenant farmers who would engage in this process of what we called sharecropping. So interracial contact in the South, especially the rural South, is much higher than interracial contact in the urban North, right? So, it may be counterintuitive, but one of the things that happens in the post World War I, especially the post-World War II era, is a strong desire in northern cities to maintain racial segregation, residential segregation, even as We get decisions like Shelley v. Kramer, right? So 1948, the law changes, so you can't have restricted covenants. That's one of the obstacles to racial segregation or desegregation being removed. Well, in response to that, of course, we have to find new ways. If we want to maintain racial segregation, we have to find new mechanisms and new ways to do that. The most prevalent kind of approach was an approach known as redlining. Now, redlining was a policy that was promoted by the Federal Housing Authority, right, so the U.S. government, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a body that was designed to help people who were going to buy homes secure financing to purchase homes. So these organizations would get out city maps, and they would look at neighborhoods that had a high concentration of non-white residents, and this is, of course, a legacy or a holdover effect of previous years in which blacks were relegated to racial ghettos within urban settings like Milwaukee and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and all of these other, Buffalo, all these other industrial northern cities. So they would draw on the map in a red pen, they would draw a line around a neighborhood that was mostly black. And that's where the term redlining comes from. So based on the racial composition and or the average income in a neighborhood, and we know the way in which ethnicity and economic inequality can significantly overlap, based on the composition of that neighborhood, banks would not make loans to people who live in those neighborhoods, nor would they issue insurance to people who lived in those neighborhoods, thus effectively prohibiting blacks from being able to take advantage of financing opportunities that would have allowed them to move out of the cities or move out of the neighborhoods they lived in into other neighborhoods within the cities. This is part of the reason why the suburbanization that occurs in the post-World War II era is almost exclusively white, right? We don't see significant black suburbanization until much later. It's because the ability to secure the financial means to purchase a house in the suburbs is being curtailed by the fact that banks aren't going to lend to people inside these predominantly non-white neighborhoods. That's what redlining was, right? So literally just drawing red lines on the map. There were a couple of other practices that were engaged in by people within the real estate sector of the economy. One was called blockbusting. Blockbusting is a practice where real estate agents or property speculators would kind of try to scare white people into selling their houses at low prices by telling them that blacks were supposedly going to be moving into the neighborhood, or that Mexicans were going to be moving into the neighborhood. And whites, sort of fearful of losing whatever equity they've built up in the homes they own, because their assumption is that the presence of blacks in their community is going to lower their property values, they sell their home. This is a way of creating churn in the real estate market and giving these white residents an opportunity to take out a loan and then move out to the suburbs. Another practice that sort of helps to reinforce or maintain residential racial segregation is a practice called racial steering. Racial steering is a practice where real estate agents will show white customers homes in all white areas or neighborhoods, and they'll show black customers homes in all black or racially mixed areas or neighborhoods, with the idea that maybe on the surface, an assumption that whites would prefer to live near whites and non-whites would prefer to live in racially mixed neighborhoods, or maybe neighborhoods that were made up of their racial or ethnic group. But really the effect was that it allowed for the maintenance of a relatively high degree of racial segregation when it came to where people lived. So when we look at the structural and social causes of residential segregation, we see that there are three real broad categories of causes. One, economic explanations. That's kind of reflected in again, the way that the financial sector responded to efforts by whites versus blacks to secure financial resources so that they could move out of the racially segregated neighborhoods that they lived in. Also, of course, in this post-World War II era, you also have the FHA making low-interest loans, not only prohibiting loans to people within these redlined communities, but making federally backed low-interest loans and zero down payment loans available for white returning GIs, right? People coming back from the European Theater of Operations or the Pacific Theater, right? Veterans coming back from World War II. The idea was give them money to buy homes out in these newly developing suburbs. Also, of course, to give them money to go to college on the GI Bill. Those resources and those opportunities were not extended to black GIs, even though African Americans had served and Mexican Americans had served in the U.S. military in both the Pacific and in Europe. Their access to those kinds of opportunities were denied to them based on race. So economic inequalities and economic explanations are the predominant reason why we have residential racial segregation and residential discrimination. But there is also white preference and, to a lesser extent, black preference. So people do often make real estate choices based on affinity and a desire to live in a community where people are kind of like them. So I think you put those three things together and you get kind of a broad set of structural and cultural underpinnings that allow residential segregation to continue. And the problem, I think, the problem by and large is not that people are choosing to live in communities where people are like them. It's that people in predominantly white communities are using the law, but also using other kinds of practices to prohibit people of color from moving into their communities. So there's a significant amount of resistance to desegregation, and it is predominantly located in the white community. And in white neighborhoods and areas. And what happens, of course, as all of this kind of comes together in the post-World War II era, is a significant increase in white suburbanization, what we've come to call white flight, which is this large-scale migration of whites of a variety of European ancestry. So it includes, of course, sort of the stereotypical white Anglo majority that was in place from the founding of the country, but also more recent arrivals like white ethnics, Poles and Italians and Irish, right? They also are kind of, as they become increasingly white, as their behaviors increasingly reflect a degree of Anglo conformity, they are also moving out to these suburbs. So they're moving from racially mixed or increasingly racially mixed settings in urban areas to almost exclusively or completely exclusively white suburban communities. And so, again, just as a shorthand, it came to be called white flight. So that brings us kind of up to the present, right? We still have these high degrees of racial residential segregation, and some of it is, as I said, a kind of legacy. People live where they've lived, and if you own a home, it isn't simply a question of saying, well, we'd really like to live somewhere else, right? You have to be able to sell your home before you would leave. And most people, I suppose some people could afford to buy a new house and hold on to their old house. But my guess is that most people are looking to sell the house they live in first before they move to a new neighborhood and a new community and buy a new house there. So some of the racial segregation that we see in residential areas in housing in the United States is a function of that. But I think a bigger part of it is that there is still ongoing discrimination, right? The discrimination is no longer legal. I'm sorry, I said the largest share. I think the largest share is that legacy effect, but I think a significant portion, that's what I meant to say, a significant portion of what we see is still kind of discriminatory acts and behaviors. It's just they get a little bit more subtle, they get a little bit more hidden, given that most of them are either illegal or kind of not official policies of, say, for example, real estate companies or the people who work in those industries. One of the ways that you can expose housing discrimination, and this is something we see in employment discrimination and other kinds of discrimination as well, because you can't point to a law. You can't point to a law and say, this is the law that makes this happen. Nor is it easy to point to the racist intent or the bigoted intent of the people who are engaging in these practices, right? Because people have become very, very good at masking whatever prejudice or bias they might experience, given that they understand that there's a social undesirability to holding certain of those attitudes. So what happens to help sort of expose this is that people will engage in what are called housing audit studies, and there are a number of these out there. And in fact, I think I mentioned a few of them in the chapter. But a housing audit study is essentially a test in which home buyers of different races, but with identical credit ratings and income, will go to real estate agents for help in buying homes. And the black families will sometimes be taken to exclusively black or mixed race neighborhoods, and the white purchasers will be taken to exclusively white neighborhoods. And you see, racial steering is still a thing that happens. Or you might see real estate agents sort of making assertions that the homes that are available for you to purchase are in these neighborhoods, and because the everyday rank and file person may not have access to the full real estate database, they're left in a position where they might end up trusting the real estate agent that these are in fact the homes that are available in our price range. But then when a white family goes in exactly the same socioeconomic circumstances, they're shown a whole different set of housing options in terms of what they might be interested in purchasing. So we see the discrimination and the bias still present in the actions of people in the industry when we sort of do these kind of undercover audit studies. It's the same thing that we see with, I think I mentioned a while back, the study by Mullinahan and in which they created the resumes, right? The identical resumes. The only thing that was different was whether the applicant's name sounded white or sounded African American. And white sounding applicants with identical resumes were 50% more likely to get a call for an interview than the allegedly black applicants. Again, there are no applicants. These are all just fictitious resumes, but they are being sent out in response to real job postings, and the people on the receiving end of these resumes would sort them or in some other way differentiate the resumes with people who had names that sounded black from those that had names that sounded white, and they would be more likely to reach out to those white applicants to call them in for an interview. So there's a lot of consequence to residential racial segregation. It isn't just that people grow up in the absence of direct contact, although that's a big problem, right? Because for the contact hypothesis to work, people need to be in contact with one another, and they have to be in contact with one another and interacting with each other as nominal equals. It can't be, like we had a lot of contact between blacks and whites in the pre-Civil War American South, but it was definitely not as peers. They were definitely not equals in any sense. But some of the consequences of residential racial segregation can be very, very violent. So if we go back to the pre-Civil War the pre-World War II and even sometimes the pre-World War I era, we see race riots in the United States occurring quite regularly, even at the height of residential racial segregation. So from May to October of 1919, for example, by By the way, this is a period that we call Red Summer, because over that course of time, there were 33 riots. And I say riots, but they were more like massacres. They were more like race massacres that occurred in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. and other cities around the United States. Maybe the worst race massacre in American history occurs in Tulsa in Oklahoma in 1921 on May 31st and June 1st. In all likelihood, well over 300 black Tulsans are massacred in their residentially segregated neighborhood on the near north side of the city. So inter-ethnic and interracial violence becomes easier to perpetrate if the populations are concentrated residentially and geographically within these cities. So that's one of the consequences of housing segregation. Another is growing social isolation and racial distance. There's this concept in social science we use called social distance, which is non-locational distance, right? So we think of distance as how far away am I physically from another person, but social distance refers to kind of emotional or normative or interactional distance, right? How often do people interact? How close do people feel to members of other groups? So when we talk about social distance, we're talking about non-locational distance, and we measure it by differences in social class or race and ethnicity, but also things like frequency of interaction, the kinds of interactions, and one of the really interesting attempts to sort of systematically measure this goes back to the mid-1900s. This guy named Bogardus created what he called a social distance scale. And in this social distance scale, you would ask respondents to identify how they would feel about working with a person of color, or working or sharing a bus with a person of color, or being in the same restaurant as a person of color, or having them live on your street, go to your church, date your daughter, right? So all of these various social scenarios, and the data show that the closer, that not locational distance, but the closer socially whites and non-whites would get in these scenarios, the higher the expressed prejudice, the higher the expressed willingness for people to say, no, I don't want to be close to these people. And so you can measure social distance in lots of different ways. One last concept that I want to throw out there, and it is kind of linked to this. Well, two concepts. Let me start with spatial mismatch. So spatial mismatch is also one of the consequences of housing segregation. And this is a condition in which minority populations are largely concentrated in one place, but employment opportunities are largely found in another location, right? So there's a mismatch between where people live and where they find their jobs, right? That's what we mean spatial mismatch. And there are four forces that are connected to this. One, relatively inexpensive land, which is often where production is located, often tends to be outside of urban centers, right? Before the mid-1900s, factories and other manufacturing was all done sort of in a central urban area. But as factories got bigger, and as production increased, especially in the post-World War II era, manufacturers needed a lot more space. And by that time, most cities, the cores were already fairly densely developed. And so what often happened was that factories and other manufacturing interests would go out into the suburbs and into the hinterlands. Very, very beneficial to whites who were also sort of moving out of the cities and into the suburbs, but for blacks who were kind of left behind, and for Latinos who were kind of left behind, the opportunity to work in those kinds of occupations kind of starts to decline because those jobs are increasingly physically far away. So that's the first factor that goes into spatial mismatch. The second is that in this period, we also see the rise in automation, right? Automation is replacing a lot of workers, leaving them in situations where even if there are factory jobs near where they live in the urban centers, the number of jobs in those factories is going down as a result of automation. Third factor is what we call relocation. You probably think of this as like offshoring or globalization, right? So as factories move entirely out of a place like the United States to East or South Asia, that of course leaves behind all the people who used to be working in those factories, and that is a component of the fourth element or the fourth force, which is this deindustrialization. So deindustrialization is just the decline in the importance or the proportion of manufacturing industry in a nation or in an area, right? So in the city of Chicago, the 1970s and 1980s was a period of deindustrialization. Factories were leaving first for the suburbs and then eventually overseas. And that, of course, leaves racially segregated populations in places where the economic opportunities are dwindling, are diminishing. In fact, really interestingly, just as a kind of an interesting twist on a sociological level, automation, relocation, and deindustrialization are themselves tied to race and ethnicity, because the places to which these factories relocate are places generally in the global south and in developing parts of the world, which are predominantly non-white, and become places where corporations and transnational capitalist firms can sort of globally exploit inexpensive, cheap labor of color. So most of our clothes are made in places like Bangladesh, in sweatshop conditions by people who are getting paid very, very little. They're not being made in Sweden. They're not being made in Germany. They're not being made in parts of France or Italy, right? So, the globally exploitable labor pool for transnational capitalist firms is located in places that are predominantly non-white. And this is not just confined to the United States. Right now, China is beginning to significantly deindustrialize and relocate its manufacturing to East Africa and tapping into that global labor supply. So even non-white corporations, even firms that are owned by non-white populations are increasingly taking advantage of cheap global labor of color. However you want to phrase that. So the last thing I want to talk about are subprime loans. Subprime loans are kind of another place in which we see a kind of impact of residential segregation. And in a weird sort of way ties back to a lot of the same principles that underlie redlining, although redlining is now expressly prohibited. It is illegal to make lending decisions based on neighborhood characteristics. But the pressures that led real estate agents and members of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA to do that stuff in the first place, those pressures don't really go away. They just end up taking a new shape or a new form. And the newest form is what we call a subprime loan. So subprime loans are a kind of loan that are made to borrowers who are perceived as riskier, and that's often a function of both socioeconomic status but also race or ethnicity. And the subprime loans carry higher interest rates and less favorable repayment terms than conventional loans. So what happens is that even though borrowers of color are often eligible for conventional loans, they often get sort of steered toward and encouraged to take subprime loans. Now, they don't call them subprime loans. They call them things like adjustable rate mortgages, in which you're going to pay a really, really low interest rate for some fixed period of time, after which the rate of your mortgage will reset to reflect a higher interest rate and less favorable terms for repayment. So the rates of subprime loans to borrowers of color are greater even than the rate of subprime loans to whites. So whites also receive subprime loans because they might be working class or they might be lower middle class. But even when you're looking at blacks and whites or Latinos and whites who are receiving subprime loans, and you're making those comparisons, low-income whites in low-income neighborhoods are more likely to receive conventional loans than high-income blacks in black neighborhoods. That's why I say there's still some of that redlining kind of spirit or ethos that's at work here. But even if you have all other things being equal, and you get two applicants who are both going to be getting subprime loans, the rates and the terms for subprime loans that are going to whites generally are better than the rates and the terms that are going to black borrowers. So for one of the ways that this has consequences that, like when, for example, the housing market took a downturn in 2005 and 2006 as a kind of last stage of the economic crisis that really begins back in the 1960s and 70s. That economic collapse that led to the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009, that actually has its roots in the 1960s and early 1970s. But in the last couple of years of that kind of rolling crisis, because blacks were more likely to have subprime loans, and because Latinos were more likely to have subprime loans, when the housing market collapsed, they were much more likely to lose their homes. They were much more likely to be foreclosed on. They were much more likely to see adverse material harm than white borrowers. And white borrowers got hit too, but again, because the groups were sort of positioned differently with regard to what kind of financial instruments they had, you saw the consequences of that downturn more significantly affect black homeowners than white homeowners. So again, housing is one of those contexts in which we see a tremendous amount of discrimination, both in the contemporary moment, but also, of course, historically, which creates additional kind of legacy pressures, the kind of impact of all those antecedent conditions on the present moment. And the present moment itself is not devoid of racism or bigotry. And so a lot of inequality and a lot of discrimination occurring in this particular sector of society. Next time we'll talk a little bit about education. It's also a little bit depressing, but that's kind of what we want to do. We want to understand, when we look at American society and we say, where do we still find racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality, we have to recognize that it's still present in places like housing and education and interactions and law enforcement and all of that. So we'll pick up with that next time. And until then, I'll say have a good day and take care.